It was a typical Halloween night, 2013. I and my friends were out trick-or-treating in our quiet suburban neighborhood. We were about 14 years old at the time, still young enough to enjoy collecting candy, but old enough to venture out a bit farther than usual. The neighborhood was known for its elaborate decorations, skeletons hanging from trees, eerie sound effects echoing from front lawns, and porch lights casting spooky shadows. After making our rounds for a few hours and collecting full-size candy bars from our favorite houses, we found ourselves on a stretch of street we didn't recognize. One house in particular stood out to us. Earlier in the night, it had been dark with no sign of anyone home, but now the porch light was on, casting a dim glow over the front steps. Standing on the porch perfectly still was a clown. Not the kind of clown you see at circuses or kids' parties. This one wore a dirty, raggedy suit with a crooked painted smile and wide eyes that looked almost real. His makeup was cracked, and his hair, if you could call it that, looked like it hadn't been combed in years. We all stopped in our tracks. "That wasn't there before, right?" my friend Chris asked, breaking the silence. We shook our heads. The house had been empty when we passed by earlier, but now, this clown was just standing there staring at us. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. "What do you think? Is he giving out candy?" My friend Sarah joked, though her voice trembled a little. It felt like a challenge, and being the idiot teenagers we were, we couldn't back down. Chris stepped forward first, cautiously approaching the porch. "Hey, you got candy or something?" Chris called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The clown didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed behind us down the dark street. No words, no candy, just that eerily slow motion and the fixed stare. We laughed, but it was the kind of nervous laugh you let out when you're not sure whether to be scared or amused. Sarah tugged on my sleeve. "Let's get out of here. This is weird." As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the porch. The clown was no longer standing there. He had stepped off the porch, and though he wasn't running, he was walking toward us. Slowly, deliberately. His head tilted slightly, eyes locked on us, and his arms hanging stiffly at his sides. "He's following us," Sarah whispered. Chris picked up the pace. I followed, feeling my heart race as the footsteps behind us grew louder. But when I turned again, the clown hadn't sped up. He was still walking at that same slow, deliberate pace. Yet somehow he was always just a few steps behind. We started running, darting through a few front yards to put some distance between us and the clown. At one point, we ducked behind a row of bushes in someone's backyard, catching our breath and hoping we had lost him. I peered through the leaves expecting to see him standing there, but he was gone. The street was empty, not a sound. Relieved, we crept out from behind the bushes, laughing nervously at how ridiculous it all seemed. "Maybe it was just some guy playing a Halloween prank," Chris said, trying to shake off the tension. But something felt off. The houses around us were too quiet. The normal Halloween chaos, kids laughing, the sound of crunching leaves underfoot, was gone. We started walking back toward the main street, huddled close together. That's when we saw it again. At the far end of the street, standing under the flickering light of a street lamp, was the clown. But now there were more of them. 3, 4, maybe 5. All dressed the same, all with those cracked, painted-on smiles and wide, unblinking eyes. They were standing still like statues, but they were watching us. "How is that possible?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. I had no answer. None of us did. They started to move, all at once, stepping toward us with that same deliberate slowness, as if they had all the time in the world and knew we couldn't escape. My heart pounded in my chest as panic surged through me. This wasn't a prank. Something was seriously wrong. "Run!" Chris yelled, and we didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, sprinting down the street toward the only light we could see in the distance. As we ran, I glanced over my shoulder. The clowns hadn't sped up. They were still walking, their eyes fixed on us, their faces emotionless. Finally, we reached the end of the street and burst into a neighborhood bustling with trick-or-treaters. The normal Halloween sounds returned, the laughter of kids, the rustling of costumes, and the glow of porch lights. We turned to look behind us, but the clowns were gone. Just like that, they had vanished. We stood there panting, scanning the shadows, but there was no sign of them. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. We never found out. The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us could shake the feeling that we had been followed by something more than just people in costumes. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about those clowns and the way they moved like they were playing some twisted game only they understood. Every Halloween, I wonder if they'll return standing silently in the shadows, waiting for us to walk by. It was Halloween night, and the excitement in the air was electric. I was getting ready for one of the biggest parties of the year at my friend John's house. Everyone from our college was buzzing about it, and the thought of costumes, candy, and music filled me with anticipation. As I looked in the mirror, I adjusted my witch hat and checked my makeup. I couldn't wait to see everyone's costumes. When I arrived at John's place, the atmosphere was vibrant. People were dancing in the living room, and laughter echoed through the house. I spotted a group of friends gathered around a table, sharing stories and munching on snacks. The smell of pizza wafted through the air, mixing with the scent of pumpkin spice candles. I felt a rush of excitement as I joined the party. As I mingled, I noticed Jordan, one of my close friends, whispering with a few others. His eyes sparkled with mischief. I felt a knot in my stomach. Whenever Jordan had that look, something was about to go down. "What's going on, Jordan?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide my concern. "Oh, just planning a little prank for the party," he replied, grinning widely. "It'll be hilarious. Just be careful, okay? We don't want anyone getting hurt," I cautioned, feeling the unease creep back in. But Jordan waved me off, his excitement too contagious to ignore. As the night went on, I got lost in the music and laughter. Everyone was dressed up in amazing costumes, superheroes, witches, and creepy creatures. The decorations were on point, with fake cobwebs and glowing pumpkins in every corner. But every time I glanced at Jordan, I felt a lingering anxiety. I knew he was up to something, but I could sense that it might go too far. The clock struck midnight, and the energy in the room peaked. People cheered, and I joined in, feeling the thrill of the moment. Jordan had set up a fake spider to drop down as a harmless prank. Without warning, the spider plunged right down onto Casey's path. She was standing directly beneath it, dressed as a vampire, when she turned to see what the commotion was about. The spider landed right in front of her face, and in a moment of shock, she stumbled backward. Everything seemed to slow down as Casey, trying to steady herself, tripped over a loose cord on the floor. Her arms flailed, but it was too late. She lost her balance and fell, her head hitting the edge of the coffee table with a hard, sickening thud. The sound cut through the room, instantly killing any sense of fun or excitement. "Casey!" I screamed, rushing over as she laid there, not moving. Blood started trickling from a small gash on her forehead. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched next to her, my hands shaking. The room went dead silent. People stood frozen in place, their faces pale with shock. "Somebody call 911!" I shouted, my voice trembling as panic set in. Casey's eyes fluttered slightly, but they were dazed, struggling to stay conscious. Jordan stood there, staring in disbelief at what had just happened. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his face drained of color. His hands were shaking. He couldn't believe the mess he had caused. Nobody responded to him. The prank, the fun, it had all evaporated in an instant, replaced with fear. The paramedics arrived quickly, pushing through the crowd. I watched helplessly as they checked on Casey, who was now being lifted onto a stretcher. My stomach twisted with fear as I realized how serious this could be. "Who's responsible for this?" one of the paramedics asked, looking around at us sternly. Jordan took a step forward, but John cut him off. "You can't take the blame alone, Jordan. We all knew you were planning that prank." "Yeah, and it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't encouraged him," Sam chimed in, anger bubbling over. The room was filled with tension as friends began to argue, their faces etched with fear and confusion. "Everyone, stay calm," I yelled, but nobody seemed to hear me over the chaos. Casey, still conscious but groggy, looked around. "What happened?" she asked weakly, confusion etched across her face. "It's going to be okay," a paramedic assured her. "We're taking you to the hospital." As they wheeled Casey away, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. They turned to us and said, "If this is serious, we'll have to report it. This could lead to big trouble." Those words hung in the air like a dark cloud as they left. "I just wanted everyone to have a good time," Jordan said, pacing nervously. The room was silent, tension hanging in the air. We all exchanged glances, unsure of what to say next. The weight of the situation was sinking in, and the reality of what had just happened left us feeling uneasy. Then, a knock at the door interrupted the silence. A police officer stood outside, asking to speak with someone about the incident. My heart sank as I realized this was getting more serious than we'd imagined. What was supposed to be a fun Halloween night had turned into a nightmare. As we talked to the officer, I looked around at my friends, realizing that the laughter and joy we once shared had vanished. Instead, we were left with fear, guilt, and uncertainty. After what felt like hours, the officer left, leaving us to sort through the mess. At this point, everyone began to leave, the once vibrant energy replaced with a heavy silence. I stood in the empty room, looking around at the remnants of what had been a fun night. The decorations felt haunting now, a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Halloween had always been about fun and laughter, but this night turned out to be different. I had just finished visiting a friend's Halloween party in a small town outside the city, and it was getting late, around midnight. As I drove home, my car was the only one on the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was a long stretch of highway, with nothing but trees on either side. I could hear the hum of my car's engine as it rolled down the empty road. I was a bit tired, but eager to get home when I noticed headlights approaching from behind in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and another car on the road wasn't unusual. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just another car driving late at night, I figured. But then, the car started speeding up, getting closer to me. I could feel my heart begin to race as the vehicle came right up behind me, practically on my bumper. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed on the top of the car. It was unmarked, but the flashing lights were unmistakable. It looked like a police car. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong, but getting pulled over always makes anyone nervous. I slowed down, signaling to the right, and pulled off to the side of the road. The car behind me did the same. I took a deep breath and watched in my side mirror as the driver got out of the car. Something immediately felt off. The man who approached wasn't wearing a regular police uniform. Instead, he had on some sort of costume, like something from an old movie, a dark trench coat and an odd wide-brimmed hat. It didn't look like what a cop would wear, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was Halloween, and this officer was just in the spirit of things. He tapped on my window with a gloved hand. I rolled it down slowly. "Step out of the vehicle," he said in a low voice. My heart raced. That was strange. Usually, police officers ask for your license and registration first, right? But something about his tone made me feel like I should listen. I hesitated for a moment, but then grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, just in case. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, more firmly this time. His face was half hidden by the shadow of his hat, but I could see the coldness in his eyes. That's when I realized something wasn't right. My gut told me this wasn't a real cop. "I don't feel safe stepping out," I said, trying to stay calm but feeling my hands tremble. "Can I see some identification?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me for a few seconds. It felt like forever. Then, without a word, he walked back toward his car. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he was going to get some kind of ID, and I tried to relax. But then I saw him reach into his coat and pull something out. It wasn't an ID. It looked like a weapon. Panic hit me like a wave. I didn't have time to think. I acted purely on instinct. Without waiting another second, I threw my car into gear and hit the gas. The tires screeched as I sped off, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, the unmarked car was right behind me again, speeding after me. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't stop. Not out here, not on this dark, empty road with that man chasing me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to stay focused as I sped down the highway. The car behind me was gaining on me, its headlights glaring in my mirror. My phone was still on the passenger seat. I grabbed it with one hand, frantically trying to dial 911. The phone shook in my trembling hand as I pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through, calm and collected. I'm being chased. There's someone pretending to be a cop, trying to pull me over. He's following me, and I think he's armed, I said, my voice barely under control. Stay calm, the operator said. Where are you right now? I quickly described the highway I was on and tried to give as much information as I could, all while keeping my eyes on the road. The fake officer was still tailing me, his car swerving wildly as he tried to catch up. The operator told me to keep driving toward the nearest town, where they would send real police officers to meet me. She kept me on the line, asking questions to keep me focused. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I could still see the fake cop's car in my mirror, but thankfully, he wasn't getting any closer. My car was faster, and with each mile, I put more distance between us. But I didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights ahead, a small town coming into view. The streetlights and houses were like a beacon of hope. As I got closer, I noticed 2 police cars waiting on the side of the road, their blue and red lights flashing. Relief washed over me. I had made it. However, after everything that had just happened, I was still on edge. Part of me wondered if these police cars were real or just another trap. But then I remembered a few key points that gave me hope. While I was on the phone with the 911 operator, she had assured me that they were sending officers to meet me. When I saw the police cars in the exact spot I was told to drive toward, it matched what the dispatcher had said. Unlike the unmarked car that had pulled me over earlier, these police cars were marked. They had the official logos, sirens, and flashing lights that you would expect from real law enforcement vehicles. That was a huge difference and helped ease my fear. When I pulled up next to them, the way the officers approached my car was professional and calm. They stayed back, asked me to keep my hands visible, and followed standard police protocol. Everything felt more structured by the book compared to the shady way the fake officer acted. The fake cop's car had vanished. He must have turned off the road when he realized I was heading toward help. I was shaking as I got out of the car, but I was safe. The police took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area to look for the suspect. They told me stories of similar incidents where criminals dressed up as police officers to lure people in. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I had come so close to something terrible happening that night, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had stepped out of my car when the man first approached me. It was a long night, filled with police reports and adrenaline still coursing through my veins. But I was grateful to be alive, grateful I had trusted my instincts. Halloween night had turned into a real-life nightmare, one I would never forget. I had just left the hospital late on Halloween night. My son Daniel had been admitted earlier in the day. He had a fever that just wouldn't break, and the doctor thought it best to keep him there for a few days. It had been a rough day seeing him sick and helpless, and I hadn't brought anything with me, so I had to head home to get some clothes and things we'd need for the few days we would be there. John, my husband, was home with our other 2 kids. He had called earlier, worried like I was. "Sarah, Daniel's going to be fine. Just come get what you need and go back. I'll hold down the fort here." Driving back home, the streets were unusually quiet, not that I cared. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I noticed someone by the side of the road, standing still. I slowed down just a bit to get a better look. It was a man, pale and ragged-looking, holding a sign. It said, "Help." I don't know why, but a chill went through me as I passed him. There was something strange about the way he stood there, motionless, staring straight at my car. But it was late, and I wasn't about to stop for anyone. I just sped up and tried to shake it off. When I got home, John was waiting for me. The kids were asleep and the house was quiet. He could tell something was off just by looking at me. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. "There was a man on the road. He was holding a sign asking for help," I said, my voice trembling a little. I didn't stop, but it felt off. "Where?" he asked, frowning. "About halfway here, but it's probably nothing. I'm just tired." John didn't say much, but he walked with me to the front door, his presence reassuring. As I grabbed my stuff and headed back to the car, something strange caught my eye. The trunk, it was slightly open. I froze. I was sure I hadn't opened the trunk. My heart started racing as I walked over to check it. Slowly, I lifted it, and there it was. My mind raced. How could that sign be here? I hadn't stopped. I ran back inside, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed to John. He saw the panic on my face before I could even explain. "There's a sign in my car. His sign, the one from the road," I said, shaking. "It's in the trunk, John." John's expression turned from confusion to something darker. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. "Stay inside with the kids. I'll check it out." I stood by the door, watching as he walked to the car. My heart was pounding in my ears. He looked around the car, removed the sign, threw it away, and even scanned the street with the flashlight. After a few tense minutes, he came back. "No one's out there," he said, locking the door behind him. "Is it the same sign you saw before?" I nodded, still shaken. John stood there for a moment, clearly thinking. "Let's not take any chances. I would have to accompany you back to the hospital, but I would also bring the kids along. And I would also call the police along the way." I didn't argue. The whole thing was too strange, and I didn't feel safe anymore. We packed up the kids in John's car, and I grabbed a few things for Daniel. As we pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't help but glance into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man again. But the streets were empty. On the drive back to the hospital, John called the police and reported the situation. They said they'd send a patrol car to check the area, but they didn't sound too concerned. It was probably just some guy playing a prank, they said. But it didn't feel like a prank. Not when I saw that sign in my trunk. My hands were shaking the entire drive. I just wanted to get back to the hospital and check on my son. We reached the hospital without incident, and John parked next to me. We went into Daniel's room with the kids. Daniel was still sleeping peacefully, the nurses checking on him. But I couldn't shake the feeling of what happened earlier. I caught John's eye, and he just gave me a reassuring nod. The police called us back later, saying they hadn't found anyone on the road or around our house. They chalked it up to Halloween night mischief, but deep down, I knew better. I haven't seen that man since. But even now, every time I drive that road late at night, I catch myself glancing at the side of the road, half expecting to see him there waiting and holding that same sign, and also always wondering who he was really and what he wanted from me. Before we move to the next story, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on the post notification. Also, like and share with your friends. We need your support. I'm 21, still living at home while finishing up my last year of college. My younger siblings were out trick-or-treating with my parents, and for the first time in years, I opted to stay behind. Honestly, I thought I was too old to be walking around with a bucket asking for candy, and I had a ton of assignments due. I figured I'd just relax, maybe binge-watch some horror movies while the house was quiet. I've always liked scary stuff until it became real. I'm just an ordinary guy, tall and skinny, with dark hair that I really needed to cut. I usually don't get scared easily. But that night changed everything. I learned that everyone has a breaking point, even me. It was just after 8 p.m., and the trick-or-treaters were still out in full force. Now and then, I'd hear them giggling and shouting as they ran down the street. The occasional knock on the door broke the silence as more kids came by for candy. After the third group had left, I closed the door and went back to my horror movie marathon. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, half watching the screen, completely unaware that my night was about to take a terrifying turn. Just as I started to get comfortable, I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, like footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. My first thought was that it was just more kids playing pranks. Halloween night, right? It's what they do. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder. Curious, I walked over to the window to take a peek. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure standing still in the driveway. It was wearing a long, dark costume, the kind you might see in a low-budget slasher film, and its face was hidden behind a blank white mask, the kind that doesn't have any expression, just empty eye holes and a twisted smile. Creepy as hell. At first, I thought it had to be a prank, maybe someone's older sibling trying to scare the neighborhood kids. But as I stared at the figure, it just stood there, not moving a muscle. I pulled the curtain closed, hoping that whoever it was would lose interest and go bother someone else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there. I tried to focus back on my movie, but my mind kept wandering back to that figure. A chill crept up my spine. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was more like a scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the pavement. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I approached the window again, lifting the edge of the curtain to get another look. The figure was closer now. It had moved from the driveway to just outside the porch, standing directly in front of the window, staring in. My stomach twisted into knots. It was holding something long and metallic, dragging it behind. The mask's lifeless grin seemed to mock me. Okay, now I was officially freaked out. I quickly backed away from the window, my mind racing. What should I do? I thought about calling the police. But what was I supposed to say? And I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. Maybe the figure would leave on its own, right? I wasn't about to take any chances, though. I hurried over to the front door, making sure it was locked. Then I went to the back door, double-checking that it was secure, too. As I stood there listening for any more sounds, everything suddenly went quiet. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door handle rattling. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming from the front door. Whoever was outside was now trying to get inside. My heart pounded against my chest as I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the table beside me. I wasn't thinking clearly, just reacting. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, like they were getting frustrated. "Hey! Stop it!" I shouted, my voice shaking. Then the rattling stopped. For a moment I thought maybe it had finally given up. That hope disappeared when I heard the sharp crack of glass breaking. I spun around and saw the window near the front door had been smashed. The masked figure was now trying to climb through, its hand gripping the jagged glass as it pulled itself inside. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank. This was real. Without thinking, I bolted toward the back door, fumbling with the lock as I yanked it open. I didn't even look back. I just ran as fast as I could into the backyard, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted across the yard, jumped over the fence, and pounded on my neighbor's door screaming for help. The police came within minutes, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was long gone. All that was left was the broken glass and the deep sense of fear that hung over the house like a storm cloud. That Halloween night changed everything for me. I used to think I was tough and that nothing could scare me, but I learned that night that some fears are more than just in your head. And as much as I'd like to believe it was just some psycho playing a sick game, I still get chills whenever I think about the way that mask stared back at me, empty and lifeless, like it was waiting for me. I never stayed home alone on Halloween after that. It was my first week in a new city, my fresh start after a difficult breakup. I'd found an affordable apartment in an old, creaky building that had a sort of vintage charm. It was small and cozy, the kind of place where I thought I could get some peace and distance from my old life. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I hadn't spoken to many yet. The landlord, Mr. Carlyle, was a friendly older man who told me the apartment had been empty for a couple of months before I moved in. Halloween came quickly, and I decided to stay in that night. I didn't know much people in the area yet, and honestly, I just wasn't in the mood for parties or trick-or-treating. I had a small bowl of candy ready by the door, expecting a few neighborhood kids to stop by. By 9 p.m., most of the kids had already come and gone. The streets were quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional laugh or shout from groups of teenagers making their rounds. At around 11:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. I remember hesitating because it was late, and I thought all the trick-or-treaters had stopped. But it was Halloween after all, and I figured maybe a few older kids were just trying to get the last of the candy. I grabbed the bowl of candy and went to the door without checking through the peephole. When I opened the door, it wasn't kids standing there. It was a man, middle-aged, probably in his late 40s. He wasn't wearing a costume, just an old, weathered jacket and jeans. His hair was greasy, and there was something off about him. His eyes were hollow, and he had this nervous energy, like he wasn't sure what he was doing there. "Is she here?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in hours. I blinked, confused. "Who?" He stared at me for a moment, his eyes flicking past me to the hallway behind me, as if he were expecting someone to appear. "She told me to come here," he mumbled, his eyes narrowing. "She said she'd be here." A chill crept up my spine. "I think you have the wrong apartment," I said, gripping the door a little tighter. "No one told you to come here." He frowned, his face twisting in frustration, then anger. "No," he said more firmly, shaking his head. "She told me. She's here. Let me in." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. You need to leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. You've got the wrong place. Before I could react, he stepped forward, blocking the door with his foot. My heart raced as I tried to push the door shut, but he leaned in, forcing it open just enough for him to peer inside. His breath smelled foul, like stale cigarettes and something else, something metallic, like blood. She's not here, I stammered, panic rising. Please, you need to leave. He was silent for a moment, then his eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something dark, something dangerous in them. Slowly, he smiled, a cold, lifeless grin. You're lying, he whispered. She said she'd be here. She's hiding, isn't she? I slammed the door with all my strength, finally managing to shut it and turn the deadbolt. My hands shook as I fumbled to lock the chain as well. I stood there, listening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then through the door, I heard him whisper, "I'll be back." I didn't move for a long time. When I finally peeked through the peephole, he was gone. But the feeling of his presence lingered like a cold shadow. The next morning, I called Mr. Carlyle, my landlord. I was still shaken, and I wanted to know if he had any idea who the man might have been. That's when he hesitated, his voice dropping. "You said he asked for someone," Mr. Carlyle asked cautiously. "Yeah, he kept asking for someone. He was convinced a woman was here waiting for him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. "The woman who lived in your apartment before you had some trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. "She broke her lease and left town in a hurry. She had an ex-boyfriend who wouldn't leave her alone. He'd show up at all hours, demanding to see her, convinced she was hiding from him. He even broke in once, trying to find her. I thought he'd stopped after she moved out." My blood ran cold as I realized the man at my door had been her ex-boyfriend. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, that he might come back. I double-checked the locks every night. A week later, I came home late from work. It was dark, and as I walked up to my building, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Across the street, leaning against a tree, was the man. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring up at my apartment window. I ducked inside the building, heart pounding, and rushed up to my floor. When I peered out from behind the curtains, he was still there, waiting, watching. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. No one had seen him, and he hadn't done anything illegal yet. For weeks I lived in fear, jumping at shadows, terrified of when he might come back. I never saw him again, but I could never shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, still looking for the woman who used to live here, still waiting for her to come back. My neighbors always kept to themselves, especially one house across the street that always seemed a bit off. The Johnsons had lived there for a long time, but they were never seen often. But since I moved in, I had seen their porch light flicker on and off at night, but the house remained dark always at night and empty during the day. The only time I'd seen Mr. Johnson was when he hurried to his car. His gaze darted away, and something about his presence felt deeply unnerving. It was Halloween night when this incident occurred, and also to mention, I am in my mid-20s. I was looking forward to handing out candy and enjoying the trick-or-treaters. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the neighborhood, the sounds of laughter and excitement filled the air. Children ran from door to door, their costumes shimmering in the streetlights. As the evening progressed, I noticed the Johnson porch light had just flickered. I glanced over at their front yard, where the shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch almost beckoning. Around 9 p.m., I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I walked past the Johnsons' house, glancing at their unkempt lawn and the darkened windows. Just as I turned to leave, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a soft thud, followed by a faint cry. My heart raced. I was certain I had heard something. Cautiously, I approached the side of the house where the shadows hung thick like a blanket. My heart pounded as I strained my ears, waiting to hear it again. Then it came, a faint, muffled voice. "Help, please." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real, or was it just some Halloween prank? But something in the tone, desperate and scared, made me stop in my tracks. I glanced around, checking if anyone else had heard it, but the street was deserted. With trembling hands, I moved closer, the sense of dread tightening its grip on me. The sound was coming from a small, dirty basement window near the ground. As I crouched to peer through the cracked glass, I saw her. A girl, no more than 10 years old, huddled in the corner. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her clothes were torn and grimy. But it was her eyes that caught me, wide, terrified, pleading. "Help me," she whispered frantically, her voice barely audible. My heart raced. "What happened? Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking as I glanced around again, half expecting someone to jump out. "They won't let me go," she whimpered, her voice cracking with fear. "Please help me." A cold chill ran down my spine. The Johnsons, my neighbors, could they be involved in something so dark? "Can you get out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I've tried. They'll see me if I try." My mind raced. "Stay right there," I whispered. "I'm going to get help." Just as I stood up to go, I saw a figure emerging from the back door of the Johnsons' house. It was Mr. Johnson, his tall frame illuminated by the weak porch light. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp and suspicious. I tried to remain calm. Just out for a walk," I stammered, forcing a smile and casually stepping away from the window. His eyes narrowed, locking onto mine. He stepped closer, and the air between us felt heavy. "You shouldn't be wandering around here at this hour," he said, his tone menacing. "This is private property." "I was just admiring your decorations," I said with a nervous laugh. "You really went all out for Halloween this year." He didn't smile. His face darkened. "There's nothing here for you. You should leave." I nodded and backed away slowly. I got home and immediately picked up the phone and called the police. Within a short period, red and blue lights cut through the darkness. Police cars arrived and officers moved swiftly towards the house. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened and Mr. Johnson stepped out, looking eerily calm. The police spoke to him, but I couldn't hear what was being said. Then, 2 officers entered the house. Within minutes, they came out of the house, leading the girl, pale and trembling. They continued searching the house, and not long after, they led Mr. and Mrs. Johnson out in handcuffs. They looked unbothered, almost as if they had expected this moment. Later, I found out the horrifying truth. The girl had been reported missing from a nearby town just a week ago. The Johnsons had been running a child trafficking ring. They kept them hidden in their basement until they could move them to another location. That night became a nightmare etched in my memory. What had seemed like just another quiet suburban Halloween turned into something far darker. A reminder that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they live right next door. 2017's Halloween wasn't about candy or costumes. It was about answering a dare, one that to this day I wish we had walked away from. The challenge was simple: spend an hour inside the old Hamilton mansion. It has been abandoned for years. People said it was haunted, but more than that, there were rumors of strange gatherings that took place inside, rituals performed by a group no one could ever describe. My friends, Mike, Jason, and I had been planning to break into the mansion for weeks, convinced it was just another local myth. We figured we'd sneak in, snap some pictures for Instagram, and call it a night. The mansion was more decrepit than we'd imagined. Weeds had overtaken the front lawn, shutters hung crookedly from the windows, and the once grand double doors barely hung on their hinges. The chill of the October night crept under our jackets as we pushed open the door. Inside, dusty furniture covered in sheets, broken floorboards, and peeling wallpaper greeted us. But it was the candles that stopped us cold. Dozens of candles lined the hallways, burning brightly as if they had just been lit. Their flames flickered in unison, casting eerie shadows on the walls. This wasn't the work of time, it was recent. "We're not alone here," Jason whispered. Determined not to be the first to chicken out, we pressed deeper into the house. Every step echoed louder than the last. Then, faintly at first, we heard something. Not footsteps, not voices, but a soft, rhythmic sound, a hum that seemed to come from beneath us. "We should check it out," Mike suggested. "Let's check the basement. If there were any secrets in the house, they would be down there." The staircase leading to the basement was narrow and steep, and the further down we went, the stronger that sound became. Not humming, it was chanting, low and rhythmic. We hesitated at the bottom, and that's when we saw them. A group of people, maybe a dozen, all wearing identical black robes and white masks reflecting the candlelight. They stood in a perfect circle, heads bowed, hands raised slightly in front of them, palms up. The chant they repeated was hypnotic, pulling us in, even though everything screamed to leave. We hid behind a stack of old furniture, watching in disbelief. This wasn't a Halloween prank. This was something else. Then one of the masked figures raised their head, slowly followed by the others. All stared directly at us. Their eyes, visible through the small slits in their masks, glowed faintly in the dim light. Jason crouched beside me, suddenly stood up. "We need to get out of here. Now," he whispered urgently. Jason bolted for the stairs and we followed, panic driving us. The sound of our frantic footsteps echoed as we scrambled up the stairs, and I glanced back just once. The robed figures stood at the base, watching but not chasing, their heads tilted slightly, curious. We burst through the front door, not stopping until we reached the main road, the mansion disappearing behind the trees. We didn't speak for a long time, just gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Finally, we reached Mike's car. "What the hell was that? Who were those people?" Jason asked, voice shaky. None of us had answers, but later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something. Something we weren't supposed to see. I never went back to the Hamilton mansion after that. None of us did. I wondered what would have happened if we had stayed. This time, though, instead of submitting to fear, I made a decision. If they wanted to play games, so would I. The next Halloween, I gathered my courage and returned to the mansion. This time it was just me, armed with a flashlight, a sturdy baseball bat, and a determination to confront whatever was inside. As I stepped through the threshold, the atmosphere crackled with tension, and I knew I was not alone. I heard the familiar chant echoing through the halls. I followed the sound down the stairs to the basement. The masked figures were standing in a circle. This time I didn't hide. I stepped forward, holding the bat tightly, and shouted, "What are you all doing?" The chanting stopped, and silence filled the room. The figures turned to face me. One of them took a step forward, and I gripped the bat tighter, ready to defend myself. "Who dares disturb our gathering?" the figure asked, voice low and reverberating. "I do," I said, my voice steady, even though I was a little scared. "I'm not here to run. What are you all doing?" A murmur rippled through the group, and they exchanged glances. The figure stepped closer, lifting its mask just enough for me to see its face, which was unsettlingly normal. "We seek power beyond this world," it said. "You've come to witness a transformation. Join us, or leave before you are bound to us forever." "I won't join you," I replied defiantly. The figure smiled a slow, eerie grin. "Then leave before you face the consequences." At that moment, the others began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their masked faces turning toward me as they closed in. Panic surged through my body. I saw an opening, and without a second thought, I dashed for the stairs, heart pounding in my chest like a drum. They weren't just some weird group playing games. They were something much darker, something ancient. Whether they were witches, a cult, or something even worse, I knew one thing. They were dangerous, and I had come too close to whatever power they sought. But in a strange way, I was satisfied. I had gotten my answers. They were real, and they were far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. From that day forward, every Halloween, as the chill in the air deepened and the nights grew longer, I would think about the Hamilton mansion and the dark rituals that took place behind its walls.